All right, well, here we are for the first edition of Open Mic, Central Washington Home Builders Association's monthly new program, third Wednesday of each month, where we're going to bring on elected officials, policymakers, and talk about issues that are important to our membership, the home builders in the area. Of course, we represent a 6-county region from Okanogan down to Klickitat, about 18,700 square miles worth of territory, so quite a bit. And the issues that are facing our folks tend to face others around the state as well. And for my first guest for Open Mic, I'm very excited to have State Representative David Taylor on and agreeing to sit down here with us. And so thanks for joining us, David.
Hey, you bet. My pleasure. Always happy to come in and work with the home builders to make sure that your membership is aware of what's happening around the state.
Perfect. So I thought what we'd do, if it's okay with you, maybe give us a little synopsis of the legislative session as a whole, save the good stuff like the Hirst decision for the end, because that's what I really want to dig into with you is water and water issues. But first, your thoughts on the legislative session overall.
Well, it was probably one of the more difficult sessions we've had in recent years. And I think you almost have to look back at 2017 and how that started. And then ultimately ended leading into 2018. We walked into 2017 with a Supreme Court mandate hanging over all our heads with regards to K-12 education funding. And early on in that session, my leadership team came to me and said, "Oh, by the way, you're negotiating that." And I'm a policy guy, great. I'm always have been a policy guy, but K-12 education was not really my background. So I got up to speed quickly. And we finally got that done and ultimately signed by the governor and essentially approved by the court. Unfortunately, they said you didn't fully implement it quick enough, so we had to work on that, which brought us into 2018. Then we got into the budget cycle, and of course, everybody remembers the media screaming about a government shutdown. And what I told folks back home the whole time was government will never shut down. In fact, I've got home builders, realtors, ranchers, and farmers who would actually welcome a little bit of a government shutdown. The thought of ecology not showing up at your door really is inviting to a lot of people.
Right.
And then immediately, right after the budget work ended, my leadership team came to me again and said, "Okay, now we need you to go negotiate Hirst." And so, as all of your members know, we ultimately left in July 20th, 2017, with no capital budget.
Right.
And the whole hang up on that was getting to a Hirst Fix. And we were close several times. We had the ever popular Taylor Blake amendment that was floated on June 30th, July 1, that ultimately didn't happen. So we spent the next 7 months, 6 to 7 months, continuing to negotiate. And so while everybody else was enjoying their downtime, Senator Warnock, who's also one of your representatives, she and I continue to work throughout the summer, fall, and into winter, trying to come up with a negotiated agreement on Hirst, which then brings us into 2018. We got there, which we'll come back to here in a second with the details. But really, this year was the first year since 2012 that we were under one-party control.
Right.
And so, we had the Senate under the majority coalition from 2012 through 2017. And suddenly this year we found ourselves back in one-party control. And having been through that, I had an idea of what was coming. But looking at my caucus, the House Republican caucus, we started looking at the membership that we had and realized quickly that out of our 48 members, there maybe were 16 that had been there through one-party control. So there was a lot of education, a lot of just making sure folks understood the differences, how this was going to feel, how this was going to work, and the idea of, go ahead, we don't need this fix in the House necessarily, the Senate will take care of it, was no longer an out for us. We had to make sure and do our due diligence to get the best product we could out of the House and continue working that into the Senate. So it was a little bit of a difficult year to begin with, but my leadership team, and now my new minority leader, J.T. Wilcox, who was our floor leader, in a stroke of genius this year, he he looked at me. We were sitting in appropriations, and I sit between Representative Wilcox and Representative Manweller. Manweller's also one of the Central Washington Home Builders representatives.
We have the good ones.
You do have some good ones, absolutely. And JT looks at us and he says, would you guys come to our floor leader meeting? Sure. And floor leader meetings, the elected floor leaders, they drive debate, they drive how things are going to work on the floor. And so he expanded that to include Representative Manweller and I. And by the time we got to floor action, we had targeted amendments on a whole bunch of bills that really created that contrast in Republican versus Democrat ideas in an effort to, number one, create talking points for our guys.
Right.
But number two, to put those issues on the table and have those one-on-one, two-on-two negotiations in the House to see what we could do. And we were, as a caucus, probably more successful this year than we've ever been. And I really attribute that to my leadership team.
Yeah, it's a good leadership team. JT's a great guy. And
yep.
Yeah. So before we get into the water stuff, I'm a little concerned you're going to be bored during the next session. I mean, you had K through 12 and then Hirst. What are you going to do in the next session?
Trust me, there's plenty to do. But we're still dealing with water.
Right.
The Hirst Fix. We were able to get a lot of good things in it. We were able to provide for reliable, predictable water supply for the vast majority of Washington State. But we've still got some pockets that need work.
Absolutely.
And we recognize that in order to protect people's property rights and in the case of the home builders, their ability to put a product on the market, we've got more work to do. And so, of course, water is always going to be at the forefront. I always like to remind people, whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting.
Mm-hmm.
But we've got some other outstanding issues still. We've got some budgetary issues that are going to continue to be a struggle. And of course, just the difference between approach and budgeting between Republicans and Democrats.
Right.
We as Republicans would like to see tax reform, tax reductions, keeping families having more money in their pocket, lower B&O tax rates, lower L&I rates. And on the other side of the aisle, they like to see expanded government, more social programs, more government spending. And so that's always going to be part of the budgetary process. And that's where I hope that we'll continue to be successful in getting those reforms in place that ultimately reduce the cost of government and reduce the regulatory burden on property owners.
Absolutely. That's very important. So why don't we dig into water now? You can tell us a little bit about the Hirst Fix. And of course, it doesn't necessarily address all the areas, especially in our territory. It didn't necessarily impact Kittitas County or Yakima County. And I think Okanogan has some work to do still.
They do.
So can you just take us through what the Hirst Fix actually meant for the state and sort of what's next for those other areas?
Well, so there's a couple of things there before we dig in.
Okay.
Number one, does it affect the Yakima Basin? I argue it does. What the law that passed says is additional requirements may be required in WIRS 37, 38, and 39, which is the Yakima Basin. But what nobody is discussing is that within Section 101 under 1927, which is the state building code, we included a provision that said all wells in existence up to the date of this act, which was the governor's signature, are grandfathered.
Okay.
So if you have an old stock well, if you have an old irrigation well, if you have an old well that was used for your non-commercial garden, any well that was legal under 9044-050, which is the exempt well statute, is grandfathered. So that does in fact apply in the Yakima Basin, and it creates a new issue for folks to be looking at and to evaluate existing law and local programs against that law. The other piece of whether it applies in the Yakima really is more nuanced, but what it says is that those additional requirements that may be required within WIRS 37, 38, and 39, Yakima Basin, apply in order to implement the adjudication.
Okay.
So again, very nuanced here, but that adjudication is a state adjudication, not a federal adjudication. And number two, it's a surface water adjudication, not a groundwater. So that means that your shallow wells that do have some intertie with surface waters, yes, they're going to be most likely part of that, implementing that adjudication. But if you've got a deep well in a confined aquifer that has no surface water connectivity, it doesn't apply. I mean, and I've had those conversations with the director of ecology on June 30th of last year, sitting in leadership office and arguing about confined aquifers and whether those apply and how those apply. And I looked at them and I said, I've been through your Water Conservancy Board training personally. I've been through the training. I've talked to your hydrologists. They tell me flat out there are confined aquifers all over the state, especially in the Yakima Basin. Yeah. And as such, there's no connectivity. And if there's no connectivity, then they don't impact surface flows. And the director of ecology looked at me and said, you're right.
Wow.
So we've got some opportunities here in the Yakima Basin, Yakima County, Kittitas County, down into Benton County, and frankly, in every basin across the state, to show that there are opportunities where there are no surface water interconnections, no connectivity, and therefore additional requirements shouldn't be required in those cases. So we've got some of it's nuanced, but we do have some arguments to make in order to make it easier for people to use water.
So would those impact what the county did here in Yakima with their county water system?
I certainly think it does. I think now that the law has changed, that it would be a good opportunity for some of the various organizations in the county to go back to the county commissioners and say, we would like you to reevaluate your program based on the changes under the Hirst Fix at the statewide level. If nothing else, to evaluate that program against the provisions related to the adjudication and grandfathered wells. So there's some opportunity there, and I think folks here in the Valley and in Yakima County and frankly even in Kittitas County have an opportunity to go back and evaluate their existing programs versus the new law.
Okay, good. About the rest of the state, like Okanogan and other areas.
So here's my display my ignorance here. You guys go from the Canadian border to the Oregon border. You got to click attack, right?
Right.
So the Hirst Fix is based on essentially WIRAs. It's not based, which are water resource inventory areas.
Right. Not
necessarily based on counties.
Gotcha.
Now, in some cases, they're fully contained in a county, but not all. So there's 15 critical basins within the state that were identified. 37, 38, and 39, again, are kind of a different animal, which is the Yakima Basin, but we do have some provisions related to that. In the Okanogan, they have one of their basins that has a completed watershed plan.
Okay.
And so they fall under this, I'd call it Silo 1, I guess would be the best way to put it. Because it's completed, and that's under the existing law, they go back now and evaluate their existing plan and determine whether there are additional updates that are necessary in order to protect groundwater resources and senior water rights. And in those basins, it's 3,000 gallons a day, but it's not, this is where it's different than existing law. What we always talk about around the state is an exempt well, 5,000 gallons a day, that's what you're allowed. Nobody uses it unless you're on a larger Group B water system. But it's 5,000 gallons a day, and it's been that way since 1945. Well, so in Okanogan, for example, in that Silo 1 basins, it says 3,000 gallons a day, average maximum annual daily use. So it actually, based upon the time of year, your water allowance is higher than that 3,000 gallons because it's annual usage instead of single day usage.
Okay.
And so if you just use some round numbers, if you evaluate based upon when you're going to be using water in outdoors versus strictly indoors, based on summer versus winter, you're going to be somewhere around 5,000 gallons a day in the summer. Because your winter usage is going to drop so much, and it's a balancing act, and folks are going to be able to continue to withdraw waters in those basins. That's the only basin in central Washington that's affected that way. Klickitat County has no restrictions as far as under the new Hirst law. The 3,000 gallons a day doesn't apply in Yakima, Kittitas, or Benton. So it's that silo of basins only applies as far as this area goes in the Okanogan. Silo 2, which only applies, if I remember correctly, in Western Washington, and mostly in the Puget Sound region, are limited to 950 gallons a day. But again, on an average annual consumptive usage. So your summer usage can be higher, your winter usage is obviously lower. And so there's some flexibility built into that. Those are the basins that don't have a completed water plan. So they started the plan under the old watershed planning law back in 1999. They just didn't get it done. And because they didn't have it done, while they do have some work completed, it's not codified. So they've been told, go back, finish those plans, work with ecology to develop a number of actions that are going to increase water supply. They're going to protect senior water rights. Very similar to the traditional watershed planning, but this this group's more focused at the agency level instead of the local level. I prefer the local level option. We just couldn't get those in every basin. And so the other piece of this that we got within the Hirst Fix was the actual language fix under the state subdivision code, which is RCW 5817, and the Growth Management Act. And because we had counties that are not Growth Management Act planning counties, we included the Planning Enabling Act. And what we said was these counties can rely on ecology rule. So if you go back and look at the Hirst decision, what it essentially, which is important because it is a GMA decision. The thing that everybody got wrapped up in with Hirst is that this is new water law. We have new water law in Washington State, and you have to comply, and it's going to stop all development. It was a Growth Management Act decision. It was Whatcom County versus the Western Washington Growth Management Hearings Boards. It was not a water law decision. This was a Growth Management Act decision. So we went in and actually fixed that portion of the law and said, counties, you can rely on ecology rules. So if ecology has an in-stream flow rule, that is sufficient to rely on for your planning purposes. Cities can do that now as well. And it just simply cleared up the law. We did it under the subdivision code, which is similar provisions to building code, proof of potable water. And so we got all of that cleaned up. We actually also got a foster fix, at least a partial foster fix done, which really didn't apply in Eastern Washington, Central Washington. I argue that it does much more broadly than people understand, but it was a decision out of Yelm, and what it said was that these out of kind mitigation are not sufficient to mitigate water transfers for city usage. So there's a new task force created to look at that further, but we actually included 5 pilot programs within that to show that you can in fact do out-of-kind mitigation, meaning you're not trading water for water. You're doing other actions that actually promote water supply, increase water availability, or otherwise offset the impact. And that can be as simple as opening up a culvert for fish habitat. So we got those 5 pilot programs in place that are going to continue to work to show that there are opportunities outside of water for water transfers. My biggest concern in water around Washington State is we get so focused on water for water that we lose sight of the ultimate goal. And that ultimate goal, if it truly is managing the resource, all of the resources that rely on water, it should include things like salmon habitat.
Sure.
If you're going as a water user, if you're going to require me to limit my amount of legal withdrawal in order to protect salmon, well, there's other ways that we can protect and promote salmon than simply adding more water to the system. So those processes are still ongoing. We've got actually that task force that's been put together Representative Jacqueline Maycumber, who's represents part of the Okanogan. Yep. She's been placed on that task force. So we've got a local representative there that's going to be
She's good too.
She's very good.
Very energetic. Yeah.
And really smart, and is catching on the water law very quickly. And so there's still work to do, as I said earlier, but we're plugging along. And the third and final piece of all of this is the Skagit piece. Okay. And similar to the Yakima, although it has a completely different court decision associated with it, they've shut down water use, or they had shut down water use in the Skagit Basin, which is Wirus 3 and 4. And so we worked diligently to try to get them included in the Hirst Fix. We sort of did, in a roundabout way. That grandfathering of wells certainly applies in the Skagit. But it's not enough. It wasn't a broad enough fix to open up some of that water for home builders, especially home builders throughout the Skagit. It's one of the faster growing areas. And so what we did in the capital budget was two different pieces of money that are designed specifically for water availability. One is $500,000 more on the ag side of things. How do we protect senior water rights as a property right, but increase water availability for agricultural purposes? And that's more on the agency level. And then the other piece is $2 million for a task force to look at water storage, water availability, actual consumptive use versus withdrawal, which is always lost in the discussion. And that's a task force that's starting relatively soon and will work over the next couple of years. And I've actually been placed on that task force. So we've got our water guys working hard all over the state, and we're going to continue to push to make sure that folks can exercise their property rights, build homes. One of the biggest frustrations for me is I look at Central Washington. I grew up in Ellensburg.
Right.
Now I'm down here in the 15th district outside of Moxie. And I look at these multi-generational family farms. And, you know, if you look at the statewide average age of a family, or of the principal farmer, it's getting older. And as though that next generation of farmers come back, or ranchers come back and want to take over the family business, suddenly we're in this predicament of how are they going to build a house? Because the state's put all sorts of restrictions on their ability to access water. And if, you know, one of the things they like to say in the Growth Management Act is we're going to protect and preserve agriculture. Well, how are you going to do that if that next generation can't actually move back to the farm? And so we're continuing to have those discussions and use those examples to illustrate that we have to address this holistically, and you simply can't, you know, one size fits all does not work on a statewide basis.
Right. So it sounds to me like water is going to continue to be an issue. And like you said, whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting, and everybody likes to fight, apparently.
Yeah.
Maybe we should focus more on the whiskey drinking. But I'm kind of curious. One of the great benefits of membership with CWHBA is that you're also then a member of the statewide association, BIAW. You get representation in Olympia, and also with NAHB, so you get representation in DC. Is BIAW helpful in the process and good at getting information and the others' information on how these issues are impacting?
Absolutely. There is absolutely no doubt about it. You know, I work predominantly with Jan Heimbach.
Right.
I think Jan's probably, I know she's on my speed dial. I think I'm probably on hers. But from really last July up and through the adoption and passage of the Hirst Fix, we were probably on the phone at least once a week.
Okay.
BIW put out a great piece last year at the economic impact analysis of the Hirst decision. That was hugely beneficial to us to be able to say, look, here you go. Here's what the actual impacts look like at the local level on a statewide basis. And I think it was the Vancouver newspaper actually had an editorial related to that. And of course, like all good mainstream media, they questioned the overall economic impact. Right. But what they said in it was key, was we don't believe that it's a $6 billion or whatever that number was impact. But let's assume it's $3 billion. It's still massive.
Still a lot, yeah.
And they recognize that that while they didn't necessarily agree with the final outcome as far as the numbers go, that it's still huge.
Right.
And you know, in agriculture, especially in the cattle industry, we like to talk about mainstream multiplier. For every dollar I produce as a cattle producer, it's $3 on Main Street. When you look at that at the home builder level, which is a much more investment, much higher investment, and then the return that comes with that, the mainstream multiplier is much, much, much higher. For every builder that's out there spending $1 at Lowe's, Home Depot, or one of the other lumber yards, they're paying people, and then they're spending money locally. And you start looking at that snowball effect of the mainstream multiplier, and there's no doubt that when you take $3 billion or $5 billion, depending on what number you want to use, out of the economy on a statewide basis, it has massive implications.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, it's good to hear that our builders, our membership, well represented over there in Olympia with our trade association. And of course, we've got 15 great legislators from our 6-county area, so that's fantastic. I mean, we're about out of time, but for the home builders out there, our membership, any other words of wisdom you want to leave them with as we look forward? I mean, we're going up to these elections. There's a number of initiatives with carbon taxes and various other things. Maybe what's coming up in the next session, you might think?
Well, I think this election year is vitally important. You know, we have opportunities both in the Senate and the House to switch those over to Republican control. And the biggest thing there is turnout. You know, get the vote, get out and vote. And I was speaking with Congressman Newhouse here a couple of weeks ago, and he reminded me that the history and the tradition at the national level is for the incumbent party, being Republicans, to lose seats, and actually lose the House. We saw it back in what was it, 2010?
Yeah,
it's fairly cyclical.
Yep.
For us, that means we need to turn out. And you look at what's coming on the ballot here in Washington State. We've got the carbon tax that's going to make it on the ballot. There's also a single-payer health care plan, basically an Obamacare on steroids for Washington State, that will be the single largest tax increase in the history of the state that they're gathering signatures on now in hopes of getting it on the ballot. If both of those get on the ballot, turnout's going to be vital, because we can actually, if Eastern Washington turns out, we can negate the effect King County has on the state. So turnout is vitally, vitally important. Going into next year, obviously it's a budget year. It's going to continue to be a budget battle, and it's going to be a battle of ideas. Tax increases versus government reform. And we have real opportunities to look at government reform that stimulate the economy and through economic development, predominantly for Eastern Washington, and ultimately lead to better revenue coming in through less regulation, less government interference on a daily basis.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you being the guinea pig on this first attempt at open mic. So thanks for coming in and doing this. Again, we're going to share this out on social media and our website and that type of thing. So you can share it as well if you'd like. And hopefully you'll continue to reach out to us, and we'll reach out to you. So thank you again, Representative Taylor.
You bet. Thank you. Appreciate it.